Hello everybody and welcome to OmniPoke, the channel that brings you guys everything Pokemon. I'm Jack and today we're going to be taking a look at a few online tournament results, in particular some of the tournaments that have been taking place post LAIC. Usually we'd look at sort of the whole week in any tournaments over 100 players, but there actually haven't been that many this week. So in particular I've picked out a couple that have taken place at least after Saturday, but in particular after Sunday. To sort of see how LAIC has impacted the metagame going into the Gdansk regionals, which is in 2 or 3 days time as of recording this. So yeah, going to be some interesting stuff. We're going to kick things off with the Tournament of Doom. Had 105 players, so this is one that we would normally look at anyway. And as you can see, we had a Tina win with an other come second. This is actually just like a Roaring Moon list, but as you can see, pretty standard sort of results. Got a couple of Guardies in here. Miraidon. This tournament took place on Saturday. It was around sort of just after lunchtime UK time, which means the tournament LAIC will have been sort of getting into the first couple of rounds of day 2 at this point. So we will have had a decent idea on day 2 decks, and because of that, you can start to see there's like Entei Valiants up here that maybe naturally wouldn't have been previously as popular, but in general, this is still kind of a pre-LAIC sort of meta breakdown. You can see the very hyped archetypes, Gardevoir, Chien-Pao Excalibur, Tina, Charizard, still the 4 most popular archetypes. So yeah, kind of expected. You can kind of see Roaring Moon now at this point was falling off. I think a lot of people had realised it had pretty much fumbled a lot at LAIC compared to where people expected it to be, but I think already just in general people were starting to go a bit cold on this deck regardless. So you can see it actually only comes in down at the 6th most popular deck. I mean, it still had 7 people playing it, but in a tournament of only 100 people, you know, it's not the biggest percentage. So yeah, that's sort of the meta game. Taking a look at lists, this was the winning list. A pretty bog standard Tina list, to be honest. Can't really say too much about this one. The only thing that I thought was particularly interesting is the inclusion of a 3rd Super Rod over a 4th Psychic. I'm always on the side of having more energy just for Greninja fodder regardless. Still think Tina's in a pretty good spot. I'm kind of scared of some of the results as a Tina player, I guess. The natural uptick in Iron Valiant I think is a bit scary for you because you have so many low HP basics. But I think Tina is actually holds its own at being able to Abyss Seeking into that matchup pretty well, because if you can run a pretty thin bench and just have a couple of Tinas on the bench, try and stop some Yoga Loop plays, you can try and get to 7 whilst your opponent's taking a couple of turns to take out a 2 prizer, at which point you can then turn into a 280 HP Pokemon and try and take 4 prizes with one, setting up another one, and also weaving in like Path of the Peak and Roxanne and stuff like that. So I don't think Tina's too worried about the results. I think it's probably the Lost Zone deck that actually lives the most. I think there's a few other decks that really rely on Confe, whereas Tina's Abyss Seeking actually gets by, which is pretty good. But yeah, other than that, the list is pretty standard. One less shuffle draw than I typically like to see as well. I'm really a big fan of at least either 2 Iona, 1 Rocks, or the other way around. But yeah, other than that, very, very standard list. Can't really say too much about it. And this was that 2nd place list. This sort of other variant of Roaring Moon. I've actually seen this go around a little bit, in particular in the first sort of week of Roaring Moon, or of, I guess, Paradox Rift's release, but it kind of dropped off everywhere. I'm pretty sure people started to realise this wasn't one of the strongest ways to play, and I still agree with that statement. This very much focuses on basically binning your hand, playing a load of item cards, and then using Restart to keep getting little supplementary draws here and there to just try and draw a lot of cards rather than necessarily do it with a research or anything. You've got a couple of Peony. You can see a really low support account. You've got a couple of Peony to try and pick and choose the pieces that you need, getting energy in the discard, getting E-switches, all of that kind of stuff. And yeah, I think the list is really cool, but I'm not the biggest fan. I think there's a little bit too much of a reliance on it's a little bit too. I feel it's a little bit too awkward just having these small amounts of draw when it is a very combo-based deck, and sometimes you need certain pieces before others, and if you hit certain pieces first, they end up getting clogged in your hand, like finding dark patches before you find vessels and stuff. They all end up stuck in your hand, and you can't really do much with them. Whereas at least research, you can try and accumulate a lot of cards, and you kind of work out your sequencing from there. But that kind of is what the Peony is for, I guess. It helps you smooth out those kind of awkward turns here and there. So yeah, it's been a while since I've seen a Peony based engine. I always liked them back when they were first released, but I don't think they're particularly strong now. I also think there's some like super drimbable cards, things like the Grabber and things like that. Again, personally, I don't know whether they were for specific reasons, but I feel like just more like a fourth earthen vessel over like energy search. It feels like some of those sometimes, or in addition to energy search, some of those sometimes are going to be a bit better than random grabbers and stuff, which you almost never want to see on your turn one because you just want to really be focusing on trying to get that turn one attack. But then these cards, I guess, are kind of cool in the mid to late game. It's always one of these weird ones, especially with sort of engines like Peony, where you have to dump and discard your hand all the time, and engines like Research and stuff to play these cute one-off cards that help here and there that don't necessarily support your strategy because you never know whether you're going to have them at the right time and things like that. At least Grabber's like always universal information, which is good, but you don't even have really much you can do with that information. There's no shuffle draw or anything in here, so you can't necessarily like choose to Ion or anything at a particular time. So yeah, very interesting list. I'm much more of a fan of the more traditional Roaring Moon builds, but again, they didn't do particularly well, so maybe this is a great way to play Roaring Moon, or maybe the One Prize build that we've kind of chatted about a bit on the channel as well is worth investing some time into. I can't see this being the right way, though. I think it's a little bit too fragile in a format where there's already a lot of sort of 2v2 prize races. Having a load of Mew down on the bench is a little bit scary, I think. So yeah, not the biggest fan personally, but I can see like merit to why it's there, I guess. Onto the Pokemon Battle Park tournament. This took place on, I think it was the Sunday. Yeah, Sunday at 5 p.m. GMT. So by then we did have a winner of the tournament. We've got 116 players. So yeah, by then we did have a winner of the overall LAIC. So we kind of knew what the results were by then. And as you can see, Miraidon was able to win. Now, this wasn't a Miraidon list that was particularly similar to the winning list, but obviously people still backed Miraidon. There's actually a very large variety of decks, and this is going to be the tournament I will talk about the most individual decks in because you can see 7 different decks in top 8. It's pretty impressive. Yeah, and you can already see like some popular archetypes that were doing well. There's a couple of Valiants, one in top 8 and one bubbling at 9th, or yeah, I guess it will have been bubbling at 9th. A fair bit of Lost Zone in top 16, which is interesting given the popularity of Iron Valiant like post LAIC. Like off the back of how well it's been doing, it's been all over the ladder, Iron Valiant Entei. So pretty cool to see a few Lost Zone decks still make it into top 16. But yeah, very interesting stuff. The metagame, again, still pretty standard. The kind of more popular archetypes. Miraidon is super low, given that it was in the final and had actually won by then. I'm still quite surprised to see Miraidon this low. I at least expected it to be sort of up in the top 5 decks. But you can see everyone was on Entei Valiant, taking the same amount of placements as Charizard, and the other sort of expected decks, obviously all still being in the top sort of archetypes seeing play. So yeah, pretty interesting stuff. The winning list was this Miraidon list. Again, like I say, it was a very interesting list, very different to the one that won LAIC. This was a 19 energy build, so this really was investing a lot into electric generators, trying to hit double energy as much as possible. I can't really think of this being anything other than a basically try to go second and get a turn 2 Iron Hands as often as possible, or a turn 1 Iron Hands as often as possible kind of build. Looking at it, you've got Arvans for Forest Sealstone, you've got a hell of a lot of Beach Courts, you got Peony to basically, if you want to dump and draw and find 2 generators, which theoretically should be hitting at least 2, hopefully 3, potentially even 4 energy on that turn 1 to try and set up your Iron Hands. So this is very, very much all in on trying to make an Iron Hands on turn 1, and then you've got Bravery Charm in here to try and maybe even push that advantage even further to make it very difficult to deal with on your opponent's following turn as well. Very interesting build. I feel like I prefer the reliability or the options that the winning build from Joe played, basically because it's a little bit more reliable. You've got a couple of extra ball search cards here. This basically plays 2 VIP and 4 Ultras to find your Miraidons. Now, admittedly, you have Arvans and Peony, and I guess you can open things up saying, I always want to go second, so I'm going to have 3 Arvan, I'm going to have 4 Ultra Ball, I'm going to have a Luminion, I'm going to have 2 VIP Pass, I'm even going to have 2 Peony to, try and just find a ball search card to get going. But I do still like just having a more traditional ball or support account. I still would like to see some kind of, Iono or something in here, I think. just to, again, be able to try and then weave in an Iono on the following turn after you've had your big pop-off turn to try and make things as difficult as possible for your opponent to deal with the Iron Hands. But yeah, very interesting build. I still feel like people are going to lean more towards the traditional build of just playing like the double turbos and things like that. But this could be a really cool way of just trying to get Iron Hands and capitalize on Iron Hands' pressure as much as possible. Yeah, I feel like, again, beach courts actually go up, I think, in my estimation, a little bit, because I think a lot of people are going to be trying to basically Iono and use your own paths against you and stuff like that, as Iron Valiant here and there. So, Iron Valiant as Miraidon and Iron Hands here and there. So I don't mind beach courts just as bounces, but also, again, in this build, it makes a load of sense to try and just cycle as quickly as possible and not, you actually have very few targets that you don't mind in the active position, or starting with at least, to then try and retreat into your Iron Hands and get going. So yeah, pretty interesting. Not convinced that this is necessarily the correct way to play it, but it might actually be a little bit a better way to play it, especially in a world where Miraidon is, like the Miraidon mirror, is popular, because again, arguably, you should be able to most of the time race the more traditional builds a lot quicker, because you're able to have much more reliable generators, which means you're able to try and find a Miraidon attack turn 1 going first or going second, which is really good. So maybe this build is a bit better for the mirror. You probably lose some percentage points into some matchups because you don't have some of the disruptive tools like the Ionos and the paths and stuff like that. But if you're expecting a heavy Miraidon metagame, which maybe this weekend you are, given that its popularity, or given that its success may mean that its popularity sort of increases, as well as being a relatively pick up and play deck, this could be an interesting way of trying to counter the meta, or counter the other people picking up Miraidon, whilst also still having some strong percentage points into some of these one prize matchups where Iron Hands really tries to push him out of the game. So yeah, pretty interesting build. It was met by a Snorlax build in the final. Snorlax obviously also made top 8, which I think wasn't too... Well, it was quite surprising to see it made it all the way to the top 8, given that I think there was still a lot stacked against it, especially time-wise. But the player that made top 8 has typically made a lot of... or has had some great success in the past, sort of with other results. So it was a very good player piloting a deck that realistically was able to push in on an archetype or on a format where people weren't respecting Stall, and Stall has been better than it has ever been in the past year or so, I would say, at least since rotation for sure, because it's basically, it lost so much and we never really had a direction. Now we have enough of these controlling tool cards to be able to try and make something out of a control deck, or a Stall deck, I guess. Placing the Crabominable is quite interesting, I guess. There's a couple of potential reasons this could be for. I think it's very unlikely it's for mirror or anything like that. I think it's probably more likely for trying to have additional sort of discard synergy along with the Misfortune Sisters, to try and get rid of not just switch cards necessarily the Misfortune Sisters gets rid of, but potentially energy cards, potentially things like the Churro as well. So if you're able to get rid of the Power Pad and the Churro with the Crab, you're able to really trap something and pretty much lock down the game there. So yeah, pretty interesting stuff. I can't say I'm too familiar with a lot of the Stall lists going around right now, so I can't say whether there's too much different. I've seen Spiritomb in some, I've seen Pidgeot quite often in them, and this obviously plays no Pidgeot, which is interesting. There's not necessarily an infinite loop in this one. I guess you have Silene plus Yelchir, but that is technically not infinite, whereas Pidgeot almost always is. So there is that, but again, in a format where I feel like the Stall hype has sort of died down a little bit now. So if you're not worried about Stall or mirrors or anything like that, and you're not too worried about people teching for Stall, maybe your 60 cards is better just trying to do what you're trying to do, rather than trying to be infinite and not lose rather than anything. Maybe you're better off trying to win with extra copies of some of this disruption, some of the disruption cards. I also see there's no cross switches, which I think are often quite popular in the deck as well. I guess opting for additional switch outs like the escape rope, but also maybe just squeezing in extra tools and stuff like that. Again, I'm not 100% familiar with all of the intricacies of Stall in this format, so I can't say exactly what's missing and what's necessarily what's new in here. But yeah, still cool to see Stall making it to the finals. But yeah, was able to be taken down by Miraidon. There was an Arceus in top 4. This is a very, very interesting build. So it's pretty standard Arceus with barrel, slacking, that kind of stuff. Playing a 1/1 Leafeon, I really like Leafeon and Arceus just because turn 1 you just want Arceus plus energy attachment, and Leafeon helps with that. It also helps you hitting 200 with Trinity Nova because you can just attach 3 basic energy across 2 turns, 1 with greening cells and 2 manual attachments, and still hit 200, which is pretty cool. But 200 is way worse of a number now, especially when you can't, like, this doesn't play Choice Belt, but you can't even play Choice Belt to bump up your numbers against a lot of these EXs anyway. So it's pretty cool, it's good to see, but I don't think there's necessarily massive benefits to hitting 200, which is interesting. It plays a Medicham, and obviously it's already playing double turbos, but it plays a Medicham, which is I also find pretty interesting, because Medicham you typically see in decks which have a lot of damage manipulation, and this does play Vengeful Punch, but there's no real numbers in my head that make a lot of sense where Vengeful Punch plus like an Arceus hit or anything like that then leads to a good Yoga Loop. Vengeful Punch plus like 180 is 220, so a Yoga Loop knocks out some of the tankier V Pokemon or EX Pokemon. But yeah, Medicham I feel like is a really weird inclusion here, because there's no, typically Medicham is played in decks where you can manipulate damage counters and put a lot of damage on low HP basics or anything like that. So I'm not 100% sure on the Medicham's purpose. Obviously playing the 2 fighting means that you potentially want to Sky Uppercut with it as well, or Smash Uppercut I think is the attack as well, which is obviously potentially good into some Miraidons and things like that. But even then it feels like your damage isn't that impressive. If you're having to use a DTE, you're only doing 160. If you're not having to use a DTE, you're still doing 200. I guess with a Vengeful Punch, again, that's kind of trading, quote unquote, with a Miraidon, but this is very much on their terms rather than on your terms, which always feels a bit weird. So I feel like the benefits of this deck are basically just being a Path Judge deck still, and trying to push the opponent out by having 4 Iono plus 3 Judge. But again, Iono in the early game is typically giving them 6 cards anyway, so it feels like that's not great. It feels like the count should be swapped around. So yeah, very interesting archetype. I'm not 100% sure on necessarily why the Medicham and why Vengeful Punches over maybe some tanking tools, or maybe just in general trying to gain some spaces back over Vengeful Punch anyway. I'm sure there will have been reasons. Again, obviously they're great against Guardy, they're really good into some of these tankier Pokemon that you're not able to knock out regardless, but it all just feels a bit disjointed. So yeah, we'll be very interested to hear more about this list, and whether the Medicham was in here for any specific reasons, or whether it was just sort of, it found its way in here as one of the better fighting type attackers into theoretically what was going to be a Miraidon heavy metagame. Whilst like it wasn't too like it didn't impede on the deck too much, which is interesting. Our first Chi and Pow. This is also a pretty interesting build because there's no Barrel and it plays 3 Arven, which is pretty crazy. 4 Irida plus 3 Arven really gives you a lot of authority in getting VIP turn 1. But this list only plays, like, there's a couple of things that I'm really not a fan of with this list, and again, maybe I'm missing something, but I can't quite tell. It's only playing 2 Frigibacks, and the 2 Frigibacks it's playing are the 60 HP Frigibacks, which feels so scary in a world of Iron Valley and Entei. If you're only playing 2 Frigibacks, which I think you should always be playing 3 at least, but if you're only playing 2, it feels like at least one of them has to be a 70 HP one, just because it's 1 extra switching card or ping from the Iron Valiant deck. It feels like this deck is not completely crumbled because it is playing Palkia, so you are able to get some mid-game energy acceleration, and obviously Palkia is pretty good. Palkia V-Star in general is pretty good into the matchup regardless, because you're able to tank a lot of their hits whilst also trading realistically probably 4 prizes for 1 Palkia on 2 Entei's. But they always have things like Radiant Charizard. They're always able to just Yoga Loop your Frigibacks and then get the first hit in on a Palkia, or even take out the Palkia if they're able to Yoga Loop it on the turn that you put it down before you evolve it. Then they can then like boss it up and knock it out with pings plus Entei. So it feels like you need like another 1/1 Palkia in here just to be able to be like, okay, I've only got 1 Frigibacks down, but at least I have 2 Palkias down, so you can't deal with my Frigibacks and my 2 Palkias, so I'm guaranteed at least 1 V-Star at some point. So yeah, it feels like the support account is super heavy. I don't know whether the player was just sort of super scared of Iono or Path or anything like that to, yeah, I guess more so Iono than Path, because this list is a little bit less reliant on support, reliant on abilities. But yeah, there's definitely some questions I have about this build. I feel like Skater Spark also is it's an interesting stadium. I think it has a lot of upsides, but I feel like Again, this is another deck that is really combo heavy and needs a lot of pieces at once, and I think it's important to be able to find those pieces with Pokestop. Obviously, Pokestopping wouldn't necessarily make sense in a build like this, especially when you're playing a lower amount of Frigibacks, when you're playing a 1/1 Palkia. I've actually just noticed there's no super odds in here. It's only Clara, which is also like super slow. You really want to, like, ideally being able to super rod in and then find pieces, I guess is I guess that's actually a bit slower, but you have ways of, like, normally you would have a barrel to draw into those pieces anyway, whereas this build doesn't. So yeah, I guess Clara makes more sense in this build. But again, why would you not play the barrel? The barrel is so important for the deck. It feels like whenever I'm playing against Chien Pao, if you're able to deal with the barrel, you're able to cripple their engine so much that they're not really going to be able to do much going forward. So yeah, naturally, like, just choosing not to play the barrel is pretty interesting. Yeah, I'm not 100% sold on this build compared to more traditional builds of Chien Pao, but Chien Pao didn't necessarily do the best this weekend, so maybe it needs a breath of life. The first Entei Valiant build we're looking at looks relatively similar to the finalist build. It's playing things like a Techno Radar, which is quite interesting. No Bravery Charm. I think Bravery Charm is a huge card in the deck, though now it's known. It's, I think, a little bit weaker, but I think it was a really big card for the deck last weekend. Techno Radar, again, I'm not particularly sold on, typically because you're researching plus Squawkabilly on turn 1. You should be able to VIP pass to fill your board, and by then you should have filtered through a lot of your deck, so Techno Radar shouldn't necessarily have much value into the mid game because you've used it for all it's worth early game anyway. But it is basically like a 5th VIP pass, as well as being able to get Fire Energy in the bin for Basin, which is interesting because that has been an issue with the deck. Every now and again is trying to make sure there's enough energy in the bin to still get Basin value. Other than that, I think the build is pretty standard, though. I really like the addition of Super Rod. I played against a friend playing the deck this weekend, and we both said after the games that it felt like a Super Rod could have been really powerful in the deck, especially being able to cycle Radiant Charizard in the late game. If your opponent has to deal with Radiant Charizard because, you know, they've got 3 prizes left or whatever, they're pretty much always going to probably try to do that rather than gusting in a 2-prizer, because they're just going to reset Charizard again. So being able to Super Rod back in Charizard to then find it again, Magma Base, and attack with it twice in a game, I think is very, very cool. I think it kind of it's not particularly synergistic with Research and Colrus, because again, you're turboing through the deck. If you see this card in like the first 50% of the deck, a lot of the time it's just going to go straight to the discard pile. But I still think it potentially may be worth it just for the raw power that having 2 Radiant Charizards in one game gives you. So yeah, pretty interested in that inclusion. I do quite like it. Yeah, other than that, pretty standard build. Can't really say too much else. There was an interesting Charizard build. It had 4 Entei V. This was really, really cool to see. I'm not convinced that this is any better than other Charizard builds, but this was like really all in on just having big tanky Pokemon. So if your opponent basically ignored the ignored the Enteis and dealt with the Charmanders, they would still had to deal with Entei Vs with 230 HP, which obviously were just trying to churn through them. 4 Arven is pretty crazy, but again, it's kind of like, it's really weird. This is like an Arven build, but not the traditional Charizard Arven build, which would be like evolution based or have Pidgeot or whatever. This was just Arven to basically find Candy, find VIP plus turn 1, Candy turn 2, and just kind of go from there, which is pretty cool. League Headquarters is quite interesting. I feel like people really aren't respecting League Headquarters, because why would they be? It's not really been seen anywhere. But I still feel like there's enough stadium bounces in the format and stadium hate in the format and people being aware of things like Path to the Peak, that there are naturally some counters to stadiums, not necessarily League Headquarters, but naturally some counters to stadiums in the format regardless, meaning that I don't know how much value it actually gains other than being able to like jam it on turn 1 when your opponent has to, like, it just isn't able to perform an attack. I think in the mid game it's a lot weaker. There's also no sort of hand disruption with this build as well, which I think naturally pairs quite well with League Headquarters, because you can put League Headquarters down, Iono them, try and take out their attacker, and then make them find additional energy or additional ways of attaching energy or whatever, as well as the League Headquarters. So as well as like being Ionoed, so they have to deal with the League Headquarters as well. So yeah, interesting stuff. Vengeful Punches, I can't think for anything other than basically realizing that Guardian's going to be able to trade up with you a lot of the time. They're not going to give you too many 2 prize options. Your Charizard can deal with their EX, but they can they're pretty happy for you to deal with their EX because it just turns their reversal energies on, and it means that you're pretty much always ignoring their Gardevoir, right? So Vengeful Punch is at least making it kind of like a 2-for-2 trade makes a lot of sense here. In addition to Avery as well, Avery's quite interesting because again it's kind of hurting your damage output, but I like the idea of kind of crippling a Guardy a little bit, though I can't see a world where Guardy doesn't ever sort of keep just all of its Rolts and Curliers. It's got its attacker in the active position. It's got all of its Rolts and Curliers. It doesn't really care about Manaphy or Jirachi or anything in this matchup. It gets rid of Greninja. Nothing's really... it's not really too fussed by anything. So, don't know how strong Avery is. Maybe it's for, I guess, things like Mew and Miraidon and stuff like that as well. But yeah, not the strongest, I don't think it's the best support card. Again, I would love to see an Iono in here as well. Just being able to late game go Charizard, 330 HP, Iono. I'm going to be taking 2 knockouts in the following 2 turns. Like, find a way of dealing with this Charizard or bossing or whatever. So yeah, I'd like to see an Iono in here. But other than that, pretty interesting build to see for sure. And finally, the first Gardevoir we're actually talking about. And this is a very, very sort of standard build, I feel. There are 3... The biggest sort of thing to note is the 3rd Super Rod, which is pretty interesting. But overall, counts are kind of where people would expect them to be. Jirachi over Crest, I think, is completely fine. If anything, it's probably optimal this weekend. Or at the moment, just like post LAIC, basically because of Iron Valiant and Yoga Loop and stuff like that. So... don't mind Jirachi over Crest. I still really like Crest, but I think Jirachi's probably very responsible, to be honest. Cape over Zacian. Again, I prefer Zacian ever so slightly, but I have really wanted to find space for a Cape in my list, so can't really disagree with that one either. And there are 3 Stadium Bouncers. You've got 2 Artisan and a Collapse, so dealing with Path should be doable. I'm still playing Worker. I still value the draw 3, and I actually still really like the Lost Vacuum in the deck as well, just to be able to deal with some tools here and there. But yeah, other than that, 3 Stadium Bouncers I think is minimum. Maybe even 4 going into this weekend, just because I feel like DT Mew could be quite popular, and that's typically a deck that tries to path you a lot. So maybe a 4th. Could be interested in going in probably over the 3rd Super Rod realistically. I think that's the most flexible space. 3 VIP is quite interesting. I've actually been toying with 3 VIP myself. Feels a bit weird, but hey-ho. I refuse to believe 0 is correct, even though people have done very well with it. I just can't not play VIP in Guardy. It feels so strong when you hit it. So I'm still a VIP believer, but obviously there were lists that did very well this weekend without them. So yeah, very interesting stuff. Other than that, pretty standard build. Playing the Memory Skip. I can't think of whether Memory Skip actually hits anything super important right now, but the fact it's got 60 HP is enough for me alone to not want to play it, even if it does hit anything important, because I think regardless of what Memory Skip hits, Iron Valiant will be more popular than it, so I would rather just that 10 extra HP to try and survive a little bit more again in the Valiant matchup. So yeah, maybe there is something in particular that hits, but I can't think too much. The next tournament is the Redacted Paradox Tournament. There's had 137 players, and this was, I think, on Monday, so now we're definitely post-LAIC gaming. And you can see a lot of Tina in top 8, which was very interesting, but an overall win for Inteleon Urshifu, which is pretty cool. It was a deck that I think people haven't necessarily forgotten about, but, obviously hasn't been super popular. You can see I can't even see it on here. There was only one Inteleon Urshifu player playing in this tournament, which is pretty interesting. So, yeah, props to them, to be honest. You can see Miraidon was far and away the most popular deck, but a pretty poor win rate, which is quite interesting, 44%. So this is probably a lot of people picking up and playing the deck post LAIC to try and test it out. As you can kind of also see, Entei Valiant is up there as well. Gardevoir dropping down to 4th place, along with Goldengo. Don't know why Goldengo was so popular this tournament, but apparently Monday in the Redacted Paradox tournaments is the time to play Goldengo. But yeah, interesting. The winning list was this Rapid Strike build. No new cards. This is very, very similar to builds we've seen. Very high support account, which I really like because, again, this feels like a deck that has a lot of combo pieces, but... it really tries to just capitalize on having these very, very powerful turns. I actually really think there's potentially some room for this archetype in the format right now. I feel like your Entei Valiant matchup should be quite good because your Inteleons should naturally trade with them quite well. Typically, it's like 2 for 3, but again, you then get to eventually be in a position where you have a fresh VMAX where they're not able to one-shot it, which is pretty cool. Now, they do have things like Radzard and stuff, which is a bit scary, but yeah, pretty interesting stuff. I don't think there's too much room for maneuver with like Miraidon. Miraidon still seems quite scary. If you start Inteleon, it feels super bad. If you start Urshifu, or if you start one prizer and can Urshifu, or at least if you can VMAX, that feels really, really good. So I feel like that's probably a very polarizing matchup, like entirely based on how you set up, which is quite interesting. But yeah, nothing too surprising with the list. This looks like basically a pre-Paradox list, to be honest. I can't really say anything other than that. It wouldn't surprise me if this actually was even just someone's like pre-Paradox list and they were like, yeah, let's just jam this again and see how this does. So yeah, pretty interesting to see that it won. The only player playing it was able to win, like I say, so maybe it could make its way into the meta game. I'd be interested. I should have, before I close the tab, I should have actually checked what their matchups were. Can I do that? Should we see what their matchups were? Where are we? Standings, matchups. What do they play against? They played against a few Miraidons, a few Lost Zone variants. So yeah, you're going to farm the Lost Zone variants as you'd expect. But yeah, a couple of Miraidons. Interesting. No Valiants, no Guardies. Obviously, typically Guardi, Valiant, Mew. I guess Valiant wasn't a match before, but Guardi and Mew were the ones you didn't want to see necessarily. Sometimes Guardi was fine if you got set up, but if they got set up and like throw an EX in your face, it was kind of annoying to deal with. So, yeah, no Mews is probably one of the more notable ones, but no Guardies as well. So yeah, balances out. Regardless, really well played, and cool to see this archetype sort of rearing its head again. Another Tina. What made it, I think it was the finals. I think it was Tina that it beat in the finals. The only thing that I really wanted to mention was just the high path of the peak count. I think it's very interesting, and I think it could be a pretty strong play this weekend. Again, like I mentioned, playing the full Giratina V and full path of the peak and basically saying, okay, you're a matchup where you're going to try and bully my comp phase. I'm just going to play a path of the peak and Abyss Seeking and Colress every turn, get to 7 that way, and then basically like Roxanne or Iona you, and then set up my board and try and just lost impact all my way through the game. So yeah, definitely you can do that with full Giratina V and full Path of the Peak and just try and be a much more disruptive deck in the early to mid game as well as the late game, whereas more traditional Tina builds will go like mid game paths, sure, but they'll try and go like Roxanne counter catcher path and try and do it all at once. So yeah, could be an interesting strategy there. This is the first more traditional Roaring Moon we've seen with the double Morpeko. No sort of energy. Well, there are energy switches, but no like Moltres or anything here. This is all in on basically finding your energy switch because this is an not an Entei build. This is a Greninja build to try and Moonlight Shuriken at some point during the game as well. I'm more convinced on this list than I had been before. I think I could be getting this stat wrong, so fact check me below. But I'm pretty sure like all but one of the Roaring Moon builds that did well day 2 this weekend were Greninja builds. So I'm coming around to this more. It may be the way to play. In fact, I'm gonna check that right now. I can check that whilst we're chatting. But yeah, it's definitely a pretty interesting way of playing. Where are we? So the most successful build was a water build. I think, yeah, it was the lowest placing day 2 build from LAIC was not a water build. So yeah, this is probably the optimal way to play it, to be honest, given the LAIC results. Again, Roaring Moon kind of flopped. It's still undecided as to where it actually falls in the metagame. I actually think it's a bit better again this weekend because the pressure's off it a little bit, plus also there's more of these 2 for 2 kind of matchups, whereas I think it was super scared of Guardi, which was obviously really popular. So Guardi is still going to be the most popular deck next week, I'm adamant, but even if it drops by like 2 or 3%, that's much better for Roaring Moon, especially if those percentage points go into other racing decks where basically you can just try and outrace them. So Yeah, pretty interesting stuff. Again, nothing too special about this build other than it's just the Moonlight Shuriken build. But yeah, I'm more convinced that this is actually the way to play it now. And initially I was like, it seems way too combo-y in a combo deck already. Turns out that maybe it needs to have this sort of backdoor Moonlight Shuriken play just to actually get into the game and do something fancier than just not lose on the spot because you're a bit of the deck's a bit flat regardless. So yeah, probably the way to play it realistically. Finally, the only other deck I wanted to talk about from this tournament was a heavy Palkia build with a 1/1 Calyrex. When was the last time you saw a 1/1 Ice Rider Calyrex? Let me know. This is really interesting because this was a quad judge, quad path build. So I'm guessing the idea basically is like turn 1, you attach your energy to Palkia. Turn 2, you attach another energy, you judge, you path, and you try and just be its beat stick. Interestingly, the Calyrex does not have weakness to lightning, which means that it's probably a very good attack into the Miraidon matchup because again, it should take 4 prizes because it should be difficult for them to knock out without exactly Raichu, and if they're being path judged, hopefully it's quite difficult for them to Iono. Quite difficult for them to Raichu you through like path judge, Iono, and all that kind of stuff. Obviously, it's not crazy difficult because they can still find generators, and if they're able to find things like Flaffy's turn 1, that's pretty good. But you do still have the weird backdoor of like being able to deal with their Flaffy's turn 1 or turn 2 or Mareep's turn 2, I guess. With Radiant Greninja, with Star Portal, you can then that should hopefully like hamper a lot of their energy acceleration in the mid game, so you can then try and promote this Ice Rider mid to late game with like an Iono or a Judge again, like I say, and just basically say, okay, I'm going to be taking 2 prizes over the next couple of turns, or I'm going to be taking it like 2 prizes every turn in the next couple of turns, and you're going to find it difficult to hit 6 energy to knock out this Calyrex. 320 over 310 is actually huge just because it means the Zapdos doesn't even help you there as well. So yeah, quite interesting to see. I don't think there's too much more to this deck. I still feel like it will struggle with some racing decks. I still feel like it will struggle with things like Mew, probably Roaring Moon, and in general, I feel like I guess Zard seems kind of annoying if they're able to bump the path. It kind of presents a situation where neither of you are trading particularly well, but they have more stats than you. And in the late game, I think they're a much stronger deck. But you do still have Path and Judge, which is pretty interesting. Yeah, I'm kind of interested to see where this archetype goes. I might test this out a little bit for some League Cups sort of post-Gdansk. I don't think there's really time to put too much time into a new deck here, but could be pretty cool to see. I think there's definitely some things that could be trimmed. I feel like Avery is interesting, but not necessarily something that you get to play. I want to play more Earthen Vessels just to find energy to get them into the bin, though it does play Chi and Power, which is important. You're still able to backdoor a big KO with Chi and Power as well, which is important because you can Star Portal it. So yeah, very interesting build. I'm super interested to see whether anyone picks this up this weekend. Path Judge still seems really, really strong. Maybe this is one of the new Path Judge decks. Maybe this is a way of playing Path Judge going forward. Deck Out Mondays is the next tournament we're going to talk about. This had 169 players, so this was the largest one so far, but a little bit different. This was a Swiss-only tournament, so I'm only going to be talking about the winning list for this one. Again, you can see we are very much in post-LAIC world, though. Miraidon Flaffy was the most popular deck. Back up to more standard numbers for like Guardy and Charizard, though. Entei Valiant's still repping a big portion of the metagame, though, and then Roaring Moon and Giratina kind of where you expect them. Goldango's up here. It's more popular than things like Lugia, which is pretty funny to see. But yeah, these should be the 5 most expected archetypes this weekend. There's actually, I just realized there's a very low amount of Chi and Power. There was 1 Chi and Power Excalibur. Wow. No one wanted to play Chi and Power in this tournament. I would expect these 6, I guess, plus Chi and Pow, I think will probably be the 7 most popular archetypes this weekend. I think they show 6 or 7. If they show 6, it's probably going to be these 6. Maybe Chi and Pow instead of Roaring Moon over these, but I still feel like people will just play Roaring Moon. But yeah, pretty standard stuff I would expect to see. In fact, maybe even in these sort of percentages as well, going for in the tournament this weekend too. The winning build was a Lugia build. I really can't compel myself to play Lugia right now. I feel like Lugia is in a really tough spot. It feels like we're in a racing meta. And whilst Lugia does get to play a lot of cool one prizes like Radzard and Snorlax and stuff, there's also a lot of two prizes it has to play just to be able to get into the game, which is kind of scary. This isn't playing Iron Hands, which I think is also quite interesting because, again, a lot of the decks that aren't racing 2 for 2 are able to trade up on you. So Iron Hands is kind of like a reset button to try and gain those percentage points back into some of these one prize matchups. But yeah, no new cards I can see even. Am I missing anything? No, pretty sure there's no new cards in this build either. So again, just an old school list. Plays a Thornton, which is interesting. I think the only thing you can surprise Thornton really is like a second... Oh no, you can't even get a second Zard because of Luminous. I guess like double Drapion or double Mew. But again, Thornton feels like it's much better served as a consistency card. Gets the pump off your board, gets the Squawkabilly off your board. They can be quite important. Billy especially into like Gardevoir because they can just take 2 prizes on it mid-game, which is kind of awkward. You do have Collapsed as well though, which is interesting. Yeah, can't say too much about this build. Like I say, I really feel like Lugia is not in a good place right now, so I can't compel myself to play it. But if you're still a Lugia stan, this is the most successful Lugia list from the weekend. Finally, the Cinnabar tournament. This has actually only had 87 players, so again, wouldn't normally talk about this one, but this is the most recent tournament out of all of the ones we're going to talk about today, so I just wanted to very briefly touch on it. Like I say, 87 players, Roaring Moon, Tina, Guardi, the most popular decks. Again, kind of expected metagame, nothing too surprising, quite a low amount of Zard, but in an 87-player tournament, nothing is really an anomaly because everything is an anomaly, so yeah, nothing too surprising there. Winning list was a very, very similar build, may even be exact 60. I can't remember Noah's exact 60, may even be an exact 60 of Noah's build though, so nothing too surprising there, but again, still really, really solid archetype. An Arven build of Charizard was able to make top 8, not playing the Toadscroll stuff. I think that's very respectable. I think the Toadscroll stuff actually clogged things too much. And I actually still really like Arven Zard. I couldn't get on with it initially, Evo Zard. I couldn't get on with it initially, but I think it potentially is a better way of playing Arven Zard or playing Charizard in a world where Iron Valiant is everywhere, because at least means you get into like Aber Barrel and a Charmeleon turn 2 or turn 1, and you can kind of always represent a pretty big threat. And realistically, hopefully the Charizard can then try and like carry you through a few turns to where you can get like double Charmander down on the following turn to then hopefully like, you know, get your way into the game in the mid game, and you're not being bullied by things like Iron Valiants anymore. You've got the Jirachi in here as well, so basically the idea in my head is get a Charizard out and have that Charizard start dealing with things whilst you're then able to establish a board of Jirachi plus a couple of other Charmanders or Bidoofs or whatever, and coast out the game that way. You should theoretically be a bit more consistent than them through the rest of the game, as long as they don't basically like blow you out in the first 2 turns, which is pretty cool. And other than that, Charizard still represents massive stats. I can't really argue with playing Charizard, to be honest. Plays Vip Band and Defiance Band, which is very interesting. I get Defiance Band, but I still feel like this this can be a deck which can be quite aggressive, so Defiance Band sometimes feels a bit weird. But there's definitely going to be situations where the Pokemon that you use to Evo on turn 1 just gets blown up, and then Defiance Band is basically like semi-online for the rest of the game, which is pretty cool. So yeah, playing a Magma Basin as well, quite interesting. I guess being able to charge up a Radzard a little bit earlier without the need of a Charizard EX as well. 5 Stadium Bounces plus 4 Arvens is also really good in a weekend where I think I can see a lot of Path being played. So yeah, that also seems pretty good for being able to just Inferno Rain through the rest of the game. So yeah, pretty standard build, nothing too surprising, but can't really disagree with it. Probably a little bit safer in than playing like Pidgeys and stuff down in a world full of Iron Valiants. The first and only Mew build we're going to talk about this week. I basically wanted to point out this more than anything just because I think Mew is an obvious pick, but still actually a really good pick for this weekend. I think there wasn't a massive amount of Drapion and Spiritomb last weekend. I think it will pick up a little bit because I think people will naturally assume that Mew is a very good pick for this weekend, which I still think it is, even if Mew and Drapion, or even if Spiritomb and Drapion do pick up in play. Still think Mew is a really solid pick. I think it has decent matchups into the 2 winning decks a lot of the time. Can definitely deal with pretty much any other deck through Path Judge as well. Obviously, you're worried about some of these techs, but regardless, I still think it's a very, very solid build. Would I be playing DTE or would I be playing Fusion with like 2 Path of the Peak? I don't know. Haven't put enough time into Mew for the first time ever because I love playing Mew and it's like one of the only decks I can get points with a lot of the time. So I don't know. I don't know which I would play. I would probably play Fusion just because I like still being able to be the aggressor in some of these 2-for-2 racing matchups like Roaring Moon and Miraidon. I like still being able to be aggressive with the Meloetta plays to try and take 2 prizes on the first turn of the game, but equally trying to just stop them from actually winning through Judge Path and win through the late game instead can also be pretty strong as well. So yeah, nothing too surprising with the build. 3 Grabber I think is quite high, but we've seen 3 Grabber before. Yeah, other than that, still very, very strong, I think. This was a really interesting one. I need you guys to help me establish what's going on with this. This was a Steelix from Paradox Rift deck that uses, I guess, the Earthquake attack to deal 130 and on a 180 HP stage 1 Pokemon. I don't have much to say about this because I don't know sort of what the synergy is here. It's got the Dodrio from Paradox or from 151, sorry, as well. Which lets you draw more cards and has Ballistic Beak to try and do like 280, which is cool, I guess. Obviously, you're playing Jirachi, so you're not too worried about like Sableye or anything. But even so, it feels kind of weird. I guess against one prize matchups, you do have Steelix, which is just really tanky. So yeah, pretty interesting build. This went like 6-2-1 or 6-1-1 or something into Top Cut. So. Yeah, let me know if you know any more about this list. I haven't been up to date with like my YouTube content lately, so maybe someone's done a Decklist profile on this lately, and that's sort of warranted its success. But yeah, very weird one. I can't see too much of a compelling reason to play it. Realistically, it seems kind of clunky, but I guess there's some potential compelling reasons, like Steelix being a big 180 HP Pokemon and Dodrio being able to trade up into things. I don't know. We'll have to wait and see whether that actually becomes a real one prize archetype. Another Palkia build playing Lost Cities. The only reason I wanted to touch on this one is just basically because we're starting to see a few different Palkia builds pop up and doing like okay. So Palkia seems like it potentially could be a really good Pokemon, especially in the next couple of weeks to build around. Not sure whether this Path build is better or this Lost City build is better or whether it's just still better as a Chi-Pow Baxcalibur type deck. But we are seeing a couple of Palkia builds pop up here and there, so it wouldn't surprise me to see maybe some Palkia be a little bit popular this weekend in Cups and online results, and maybe even in the Polish regionals as well. And I think there's an Australian regionals as well this weekend as well. So yeah, maybe something with Palkia could work. It's basically like a big Entei, right? It's got 280 HP, it does way more damage, so you lose out on some of the damage you would be getting with Valiance, but instead you have way more HP and you're getting an additional 40 damage with Subspace Swell. So yeah, not 100% sure necessarily what the best Palkia build is, but Palkia is potentially an interesting one regardless. And finally, just wanted to show off what my personal favourite build of Roaring Moon is. This was a top 8 build. And I really like Moltres V still. I still feel like cross switches and Pokestop make me wince every now and again, but it's still important. Obviously, this is still playing the Water Energy package, which I think is very, very justifiable. I think realistically, just popping in a Moltres V and an additional couple of cards to sort of help supplement that makes for a really, really interesting sort of attacking option, as well as just an additional energy each turn, which is great for potentially even like chaining Radiant Greninja, but at least chaining attackers regardless. So yeah, pretty standard stuff. Final thing I wanted to look at is Late Night 153. Let me give this page a refresh because I wanted to see, 1, the metagame, but 2, how people were, or what was doing well at the top. So far, we've got an Intel Urshi, Fusion Mew, and a few Lost Zone variants in and around the top. So you can take a snapshot of this top 8 and basically not think we were even looking at a Paradox Rift meta tournament, which is pretty funny. You can see there's, in fact, let's take a look at the metagame. How popular were Entei Valiant, Miraidon Flaffy, both, Miraidon Flaffy's had a pretty low win rate. Entei Valiant's still boasting a plus 50% win rate, which is good. Tina, again, still doing really well in the online event. Lost Box Charizard, again, Sablezard, looked really good this weekend, did really well this weekend, top 8'd, so maybe even top 4'd. I can't remember where it finished, but definitely at least top 8'd, so it still looks to be really, really good. But yeah, are there any Palkia decks? I'm all in on Palkia now. I can't see any Palkia decks. Maybe a Palkia as a flash in the pan. But yeah, nothing too surprising here. Guardian, Miraidon, Lost Box, Giratina, Roaring Moon, all at the top. So yeah, pretty interesting stuff. Make sure you check out the results of this one, sort of when it's all wrapped up. Again, normally we would do this video the day after the late night, but unfortunately me and Joe are not able to because we're going to be traveling to Poland for the region this weekend when we would normally do the video. So I've decided to do it a day early so we at least look at a few tournaments here and there. Before I go, make sure you check out the Potown store for your PTCG live code needs. You can play in all these tournaments, obviously on the Play Limits platform, and you can grab your codes for playing on PTCG Live from Potown store. You can use code OmniPoke for an extra 5% off your order as well. So make sure you check them out. Thank you very much for watching. If you're heading to Poland this weekend or Brisbane or any League Cups or anything like that, make sure you have a great time. Best of luck. If you see Joe or I, make sure you say hi. And other than that, thanks for tuning in. I've been Jack from OmniPoke, and I will see you guys in another video soon. Cheers.